Welcome to the Brewing Wellness podcast, nourishing UFT members, one conversation at a time. Brewing Wellness is a podcast created by the UFT Member Assistance Program to support the mental health and well-being of our members. In order to do the work you do every day and be present for your loved ones, students, and patients, your cup has to be full. Brewing Wellness focuses on mental health and wellness topics that can help us all thrive in our professional and personal lives. We'll be releasing a new episode on the last Monday of each month. Remember to listen to the Brewing Wellness podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And please, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back to the Brewing Wellness podcast brought to you by the UFT Member Assistance Program. I'm Jocelyn, a clinician with UFT MAP, and today I'm joined by Cara Belvin, the founder of Empower, as we close out Season 6. Empower is an international nonprofit on a mission to support and connect children and young adults up through age 24 who have experienced the loss of a parent. Through community events and a one-on-one mentorship program, Empower reminds grieving young people that they are not alone and that loss is survivable. As summer comes to a close for our membership and students and staff return to classrooms, it's important to remember that many will carry more than just new school supplies with them. Some are arriving with fresh grief from recent losses, while others are still holding on to older grief that may resurface in new ways during the school year. Both can deeply affect how students learn, connect, and show up in the classroom. In this finale conversation, we'll talk about how grief shows up uniquely for young people, how it impacts their academic and emotional well-being, and what educators and school-based professionals can do to meet grieving students with compassion and care. Together, we'll explore the role schools can play in creating grief-informed spaces and the small but powerful ways educators can make sure students feel supported in some of their hardest moments. Before we start, Cara, how are you today?
I'm good, Jocelyn. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. So we've introduced you and shared a little bit about Empower, but here on the Brewing Wellness podcast, we always love to let people tell their own stories. Can you share a little bit more about yourself and what led you to create such an important nonprofit?
Yeah, I would love to highlight some of the work that we're doing at Empower for sure. But I'll start with my personal story, and everyone has their story to tell. My mom, Kit, she died of breast cancer when I was 9 years old. And I was growing up in Connecticut with an army of friends and family to support my dad and my older brother and I. But as I always say, I may as well have lived on planet Mars, for 10 years. And why I think this conversation is so important and why I love that we're talking about schools and school-based support is because I started my career as a school psychologist. And I recognize just how difficult it is, to tackle childhood bereavement in the schools. And so it's my message, of course, today and always, I was grateful to be a part of the mental health symposium that UFT did just a little while back. And my message was always take the pressure off, as a school support staff or as a general ed teacher or as an administrator, take the pressure off. But my ask is that you simply do something. And as part of my story, I wasn't exactly putting out the vibe that I wanted to talk about my mom with, people in school or friends. So I didn't talk about her. And so that's an important part of the story and how I later, came to be the founder of this nonprofit. I didn't talk about my mother. When she died, the pictures sort of came off the wall and we moved on. My father was a gym teacher. My brother and I were raised on sports analogies, and that really served us well. But we didn't talk about her, and I hold no ill will for that. And I didn't talk about it with people in the schools or outside the schools. And it was probably because I was giving off this vibe that I didn't want to talk about it, or I was learning rules that I wasn't allowed to talk about it. And so, in all, I would say that was a mistake looking back. And I wish I had been more open to talking. And I wish people in the schools even felt comfortable talking to me about it. And so a little over 10 years ago, I had this sort of nagging idea in the back of my mind, to start a nonprofit, to build community for kids who have lost a parent, kids like me and my brother. And my idea was simply to bring kids away on like Mother's Day and Father's Day and to build community in that way with peer support. And later that morphed into a one-on-one mentor program, much like Big Brothers, Big Sisters. And that's really who we are and what we do today. So we serve children and young adults up through age 24 who have experienced a loss of a mom or dad in a one-on-one mentor program and in year-round events.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for sharing how that connected to you creating this nonprofit. I think connected to what you shared, a question that I have for you is from your perspective, how does grief tend to show up in students? How does their experience differ from that of adults? And also, what are some signs that school-based professionals can look for that might suggest that a student is struggling with grief, even if they're not talking about it?
Sure. Now we know, again, as a school psychologist, I know that there are resources through the National Association of School Psychologists and lots of resources through UFT that we can look to. I do recommend one terrific resource is from Judy's House. They're a bereavement center out of Denver, Colorado, or the Dougie Center out of Portland, Oregon. And that is a very quick grab for any educator to really find the answers to your question. I can, talk for hours on this. What we know, what the research says, of course, is that grief shows up in students in very profound ways. And I can tell you from my experience, I was a straight A student. I, played sports. I ran with a good crowd. Those were things that I did very intentionally to really show the community I was okay and that my dad was doing great. That pressure really served me well. And then, of course, didn't serve me so well in other times. But we know for sure that things like decreased appetite, difficulty sleeping, decreased ability to concentrate, increased sadness, maybe around emotional holidays like Mother's Day or Father's Day, or perhaps not at all, maybe on anniversaries, maybe not on the anniversary, but maybe 2 months leading up to the anniversary. You can see some really concerning behaviors academically, socially, emotionally for children who have experienced the loss of a parent. And then there are those clear indicators that we know, grades that are slipping, it's social withdrawal. It's those things that we, as educators, we would know are more clear indicators. What I find almost more challenging is for those children that presented a lot like my brother and I, who were not communicating to anyone that we were struggling or who had the grades to suggest we weren't struggling. There are plenty of resources for us to grab that say these are the things that we should be looking for a child in who is bereaved. But it's very concerning to me when I see some children who don't show any indication at all.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think that the distinction is really important because I think in all clinical therapeutic environments, right, you look for the people whose functioning is severely impacted, but there are people who can function really, really well and they sometimes get overlooked. So I think that is important.
Yes.
Thank you for highlighting that. And what role can educators or school-based professionals realistically play in supporting grieving students while still managing the daily demands of the classroom?
You hit the nail on the head with daily demands. When I was a school psychologist and I thought about how schools were equipped or ill-equipped to deal with grief, I first really kind of thought about the ally. When we're thinking about the ally in the schools for a surviving guardian who has lost their spouse, for a child who's lost a parent, the ally could be, what's very obvious to us as the school support staff. And that's the school psychologist, the guidance counselor, and so on. But it could be an administrator, it could be a principal, it could be the gym teacher or a band teacher. It could be an ally that we've identified that could be a good communicator to the child. So I always think, to answer that question, when we say what role can the educator play, which educator are we talking about? A general ed teacher in an elementary school setting has a lot of demands throughout the day. What role can they play versus maybe for a high school student who has several different general ed teachers throughout the day and who may not, access a support staff. So one thing that I would just say is perhaps as teams, when the school's really looking at the whole child and if there's the time to really devote, that you identify really an ally, someone who's really comfortable talking to the student, pulling the student aside and checking in and asking how they're doing, or even someone in the district who's really comfortable talking to that surviving guardian. Because oftentimes I talk to schools and they'll say, well, I'm just not comfortable mentioning anything to dad because he's very private. Or, I think mom's got it all figured out right now. Mom is, just moving straight ahead. And I didn't want to bring it up to her when I saw her. I think it's obvious this takes a great deal of consideration and thoughtfulness when you're talking and trying to support a child and their family. And then I would just say very practically, I've heard some really great strategies that schools have used. It could be a code word. And that's a very practical thing that a general ed teacher, let's say in the elementary schools, can use a code word, or they can take a green pencil in the beginning of the year and say, I'm going to give you this green pencil. And this is for you to give back to me when you need support, when you need a break, when you need someone to talk with, when you really are struggling. So the green pencil or the code word are very simple. They're just quick and easy things that you can do very practically that create a culture for that child that it's safe to talk. It's safe to ask for help.
Yeah, that's a great point. Creating safety for these students. I think it sounds like safety is one of the biggest things.
Yes.
And
nothing feels safe, I'd say.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of your safety, a lot of your control. What do we lose when we've lost a parent, especially in early parent loss? I consider early parent loss under the age of 25, believe it or not. So all of that safety is really, it's gone. And so for a child to feel safe in schools, I think it needs an ally, needs somebody who is willing to bear witness to their pain and be someone they can lean on.
And what are some common mistakes or misconceptions that you think that educators or school-based professionals should avoid when trying to support students through their grief?
So I don't want to, get caught up in, I don't want to list out the things that we say that are wrong, or the things that we say that didn't serve kids like me and my brother well. And we know some of these, Jocelyn. We know, if you can avoid saying things like everything happens for a reason, or, they're in a better place. I think we've come far enough to know, perhaps we hold off on language like that. But I'm hesitant to answer your question because I'm just here trying to encourage educators to just simply say something and do something. If you say something and do something and it comes from a place of love, it can never be wrong. It's, just being thoughtful and considerate and just showing up and asking the child how they're doing. It's okay to do that. It's okay if they cry when you ask them. It's okay if they ignore you. It's, not personal. But I think the most important thing that we can do is just simply ask the child how they're doing, not worried about whether or not we're going to say the right thing or do the right thing, because all of us get it wrong. I still get it wrong. I've been running a nonprofit in the childhood bereavement space for 10 years. But I would say, if we're looking for something very practical to walk away with today in this conversation, I would say grief is not linear. And I think a lot of us have heard this, but what I mean by this is if grief is cyclical, and if my mother's death was like a tattoo, it wasn't going anywhere. It would fade perhaps at different times, but it wasn't going anywhere. I needed to accept it. Like, this was my story from the time I was 9 years old. There was like a before and an after. And in my afterlife, since I was 9 years old, there were things I just couldn't deny. I was different than my peers. I had the one thing in high school when you don't want to be different from your friends. I had the thing that made me so different. And I couldn't deny that. I was trying to deny that. And that didn't serve me well. So having an ally in the school, somebody there who knows and loves me, who could help me, really accept that this was my story. But avoiding thinking that just because maybe 2 years or 3 years has passed for that child whose mom or dad died, that they're okay and that they've moved on or moved forward through it, I think is a mistake. And so when we say grief is not linear, it's cyclical, mine was like a tattoo. It wasn't going anywhere. It meant that even 3 years later, yes, the answer is yes, I was still very much grieving the loss of my mother. I was still in a great deal of pain. I had straight A's and I played tennis and I, had a good group of friends around, and my dad was an incredible, loving, supportive father, but we were in a great deal of pain and we could have benefited from more support, I think, from the schools. So I would say the only way you're going to know how the family is doing and how that student is doing is really if you ask. And sometimes you may not get a very honest answer, and that's okay. Maybe ask 2 months later. Maybe you will get a very honest answer, and maybe it'll be very uncomfortable for everyone involved, but you can do hard things and you can, work through that. But I would simply say, a common mistake or misconception is that we don't ask how the child is doing. And so we don't know. We make assumptions. If they have straight A's, it's because they're classic overachiever, because they've lost a parent and this is what they have to prove. Or if their grades are slipping, we say, well, it's because their mom died or their dad died. But we're making assumptions. We're really not asking. what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's important to normalize is just asking the question and also normalizing that there might not be the perfect thing to say. I think a lot of educators, school-based professionals are searching for the perfect thing to
Yes.
say, and there might not be the perfect thing, but like you said, sometimes it's just really important to just say something.
Just say something.
What are some practical strategies or approaches schools can use to create a more grief-informed environment for all students?
I think there's two things that come to mind, community wide and district wide. I think just creating a culture that says, like, we can talk about hard things. And that can look to every district, Jocelyn, we know this looks different, but it can look like, that can be verbiage that's in an email blast. It could be verbiage that's on a website or that's given to the family at the start of the school year, or maybe a refresher, on January 1st. There's a culture that says, if you are concerned about your child, we will make the time. We want you to come and talk with us. My mother knew she was dying. She had breast cancer for 2 years, and she made all of this time to go talk to the school guidance counselor, where my brother was in junior high and I was in elementary school, and came in to talk to the general ed teachers. And I think that that's a very practical way for the community, community wide and district wide, to just create an air that we can talk about hard things. So the family can come, meaning the surviving guardian, can come to the school and say, I want a meeting. I don't know who I want a meeting with. I don't know if it's the principal or the school psychologist or a teacher, but I want an ally in this, and I want help raising a good, healthy human being, and I need help in it. That would allow, I think, the surviving guardian to say, I need help, and that's hard for them to do. The other thing I would say is to offer flexibility. As a school psychologist, I'm, well versed on the IEP. And at an IEP, when we're talking about a child with special needs, we will put modifications in place that are allowing for, additional test taking time, or maybe preferential seating, or it's, these simple modifications that we know go a long way for a child with special needs. But can the district, can that school make accommodations for a child in bereavement without it being on an IEP or without on a 504? What can we do? I will say, it is difficult to take a science test on a Tuesday if your school psychologist is hosting an in-school grief group for you in the morning. And so I think that, that really takes an all hands on deck approach so that everyone knows. I think what's hard for the school, and why my message has always been, I give you a free pass. I never really suggested that the schools were, totally equipped to deal with childhood bereavement, that the best thing to do is outsource it. Maybe there is a local bereavement center that you can contract with that can come in and help run a grief group, or you can make a referral to a nonprofit like Empower, and we can match the child with a mentor. Our mentors are like resource brokers for the family and the school. Our mentors are bereaved adults, so they're people like me who survived the loss of a parent, and that's really what we stand for. We stand to say, loss is survivable. This will get easier. It's hard to believe that now, but it will get easier. And we offer peer support. A lot of times kids think they're the only kid in the world whose mom or dad died in the building or in the district. And that kind of was the case for me. I really was the only girl whose mom died in my elementary school. And those feelings of isolation, I think we can mitigate with just simple changes. But again, I think flexibility, and especially at the younger ages in elementary school, we know that that's a little bit easier to manage and to kind of wrap your mind around. My mother died when I was in 4th grade. By the time I was in high school, teachers were still saying, Cara, have your mom sign this permission slip. Wow. It was as if that news didn't travel in our school district or in our, in our building. And I remember as a high schooler thinking, how is that, where's the memo that is going to go out to inform all of these people who I'm in contact with all throughout the day, from a music teacher to a gym teacher to my English teacher? They don't know my mom died. And so without real systemic change across America, there are simple ways that we can do that. And I think, again, it's having an ally and having the schools really acknowledge childhood bereavement. It should be taken very seriously and can have profound negative consequences for children who don't have support.
Yeah. How can schools foster a culture where students feel safe acknowledging grief rather than hiding it?
Well, I think that if we're honest, the more honest that we can be, I think young parent loss, the death of a young parent in a community makes us all uncomfortable at our core. And I think acknowledging that we're all, even as adults, we are uncomfortable communicating with other adults who are grieving or with children that we know and love who are grieving. I think that acknowledgement at first is going to help. Would go a long way.
So I think I'm hearing a common theme throughout all these answers is acknowledging, asking questions, and also like acknowledging your own discomfort around grief. I think
Yeah.
as school-based professionals is also really important, I'm hearing.
Yes.
And are there specific programs, resources, or rituals that you've seen work well for schools to support students in mourning?
I do. I mean, there are a lot of school districts who will partner with a bereavement center and really bring in all the evidence-based and research-based supports for bereavement and maybe creating an in-school grief group. If that's an option, I would highly recommend that. When I think about things like rituals, the first thing that comes to my mind is Mother's Day and Father's Day. I think we've come a long way. And again, for the younger kids that are maybe in elementary school, I think, as a building, we probably have, made adjustments to planning and celebrating around holidays like Mother's Day and Father's Day. I would say it's almost, harder the 2 months leading up to the day than it is the day. So it's not just about the project, the art project that kids are working on. A lot of bereaved adults like us, we have a story of, we all have a story that says, oh my God, I can't believe they made me make a project and I'm still a part of the project. Wouldn't they have taken me out of it, or wouldn't they have maybe renamed the project? And so again, I say, I give a free path and say, be honest. It's not easy for the school to handle Mother's Day and Father's Day, particularly when it was a recent death, or if it was a death that was 6, 7, 8 years prior. And rituals like anniversaries, I can't sit here and say that a school should be encouraged to, ask the child the anniversary of the death and how they want to be remembered, or if they want the school to support them in that way. The only way we know that is if we ask the child. Mm-hmm. And that could change year to year. And so again, not making assumptions that, the child's grades are slipping, or they're having trouble concentrating because Mother's Day is coming up, or because it's an anniversary of a death. We don't know that unless we've really asked the child. And asking the child really shows a lot of courage and a lot of bravery. As I say, I heard the whispers behind my back my whole life, Jocelyn. And I don't hold any ill will to anyone in the schools or family and friends, because I recognize there was just such a level of discomfort in it. And out of love, people didn't say anything to me and my brother about my mom who died. Out of love, they said, well, I don't want to rock the boat. Things look like, she looks like she's doing okay. I saw her the other day and she was fine. You don't want to rock the boat, but you would not have been reminding me of anything I had forgotten. I thought about my mother all the time. I still kept up with a life going on around me as normal. And as exhausting as that is for children, they still have to take the tests and do their homework and go to practice or be an active member of their community, despite at times feeling like it's a 1-ton brick on their chest.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And finally, if an educator or school-based professional listening today could take just one step tomorrow to better support a grieving student, what would you want that step to be?
Well, I want to, give this reminder without being intrusive. There are ways to check in without being intrusive. There are ways to create a safe space without being too intrusive. And so I would say children need a witness. And that's what I'm saying about, holding space or creating safe spaces is simply bearing witness to their pain and to their grief. And it can look like the green pencil. It can look like a code word. I think we acknowledge our own comfort or discomfort with it and then create a plan that works for all. I always say there's beauty in grief, right? The greatest gift I received in grief was empathy. And I became, I think, a rather empathetic person and set out to start a nonprofit and build community for kids was because of all of the gratitude I had for the support I did receive. So I would say, looking back, my community really did rally around my dad and my brother and I. The schools really did rally and support. No, there wasn't a lot of open communication, but there were safe spaces for me. And I'll tell you one very simple anecdote. When I was in 7th grade, now my mother had died several years before, but when I was in seventh grade, I had a science teacher and Miss Dix. And Miss Dix, one day, I know this now looking back, she knew I was struggling. I was in seventh grade. It was a new school. It was a new year. It was a new group of friends. I knew she knew I was struggling. And one day we were walking through the halls to go outside to have in the outdoor classroom. And she very intentionally, I look back on it and realize how intentional it was. She simply waited in the back. She walked with me down the hallway while the class was up ahead. And she explained to me her mom died when she was young. And
Wow.
she was saying to me, I see you, I hear you. We're all in this together. And she was trying to tell me it's going to get easier, it's going to get better. Now it was 3 years since my mother had died, but this was a junior high school teacher who experienced the loss of her mom when she was young and told me this one thing, and that one thing made me stand 2 feet taller. She was a woman in the building that I really did look up to. Now we didn't have lengthy conversations about my mom and her mom who died. We in fact never talked about it again. She did one simple thing. She saw me, she heard me, she acknowledged my loss, and she told me she understood, she could relate. And for that reason, I saw this was survivable. Here she was living a full and beautiful life as a teacher, an incredible teacher. In that one instance, she was, a mentor to me. And so I knew that was very courageous for her to say that to me. I'm sure she had, contemplated whether or not she should and how she should say it. And she just did it that one day. And that's really what I mean by, bearing witness and showing up. She was my ally, and she was a science teacher. She wasn't a school psychologist. She wasn't the principal. She was a science teacher. And I'm forever grateful for that. And so I think with that, I saw her empathy, and empathy breeds empathy. And so when you create a culture like that, I think children in bereavement really benefit.
Wow, that's really powerful. And that is it for our questions for you today. But thank you for joining us for this important conversation on supporting grieving students and for being with us. Well, thank you to the listeners for being with us throughout season 6 of the Brewing Wellness podcast. Grief is never easy for young people to navigate, and Cara's work with Empower is a powerful reminder that students don't have to face it alone. We hope that today's episode offered both insight and practical tools to help meet students with more compassion and care. As we close out the season, we're grateful to our listeners, guests, and the UFT community for walking with us in these conversations. We'll be back soon with season 7, continuing to explore the intersections of wellness, education, and community. Until then, take care, and thank you for being part of the Brewing Wellness community. And Cara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I appreciate it.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brewing Wellness podcast, brought to you by the UFT Member Assistance Program to support the mental health and well-being of our members. If you are a UFT member, the Member Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or by emailing mapinfo@uft.org. And once again, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for listening.